It took only 3 shots to shatter the world, but those bullets did not come from the assassin aiming a silenced Sig Sauer P226 directly at Ezra Thornton's heart. They came from the Waitress. Just 1 minute before, Ezra Thornton, the most powerful and feared man on the West Coast, was trapped in the Crimson Orchid's private dining room. His bodyguards were dying on the expensive Persian rug. The assassin's finger was squeezing the trigger, and the entire restaurant was frozen in a silent collective gasp. Nobody made a sound. Nobody dared to move, except for her. She was the quiet girl in a stained apron, the one everyone ignored, who was just refilling water glasses in the corner. Then, a silver tray clattered to the floor. 3 gunshots echoed in the sudden quiet. The assassin collapsed, and in an instant, every eye in the room was fixed on the Waitress, who was now holding a dead man's gun. This is a story about the most impossible choice a woman can face: saving the life of the one person she swore to destroy. It will challenge everything you think you know about revenge, forgiveness, and the price of letting go of your past. Stay with us until the very end, because the answer might just change how you see your own enemies. 6 hours before the chaos, Nora Sinclair started her shift at the Crimson Orchid, fully expecting another night of being invisible. The rain in Seattle never seems to wash anything clean. It just turns the grime into a slick, cold mess. That was exactly how she felt every single time she walked through the back entrance of that place. It was a high-end Italian restaurant where one meal cost more than her monthly rent, a place where men wore suits that were worth more than her entire existence. She knew she was an outsider here. Philip Hartwell, the manager with a permanently pinched face, never let her forget it. Table 4 is empty, Sinclair. And for goodness sake, tuck in your shirt. You look like you just crawled out of a garbage can. Yes, Philip. Her voice was always flat and lifeless, but beneath her apron, her hands were shaking. It was not because of him. It was because this was her 5th job in only 8 months. And when you are desperately trying to vanish, staying in one place for too long is a death sentence. The real advantage here was that the tips were all paid in cash. No one ever asked to see identification. That was the only thing that truly mattered. But this particular night felt different. The air was heavy, charged with electricity, like the moments right before a violent storm breaks. It began when a convoy of 3 black Escalades pulled up to the curb. A door opened, and Ezra Thornton stepped out. Nora had seen plenty of wealthy men before: tech billionaires, powerful politicians, real estate tycoons, but Ezra Thornton did not carry himself like a man who simply possessed money. He moved as if he owned the very streets of the city. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and his eyes were the color of cold gunmetal, completely devoid of any warmth. As his gaze swept across the dining room, it rested on her for a fraction of a second, but it was long enough for a chilling sensation to crawl down her spine. Then he looked away, dismissing her as if she were a piece of furniture. A wave of relief should have washed over her. Instead, all she could feel was the memory of her father's last letter, burning a hole in her mind. Thornton. It was the name of the man who had annihilated everything she had ever held dear. If this story has you hooked, go ahead and smash that like button and share this with someone you know. Make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next part of the story. But here's the critical question you need to consider. Why would a waitress, with absolutely nothing left to lose, risk her entire life to save the son of the very man who was responsible for her father's death? Philip quickly led Ezra Thornton and his men into the private room at the rear of the restaurant, where thick, Crimson, velvet curtains concealed them from the rest of the patrons. Nora watched from a safe distance, her hand still clenching the water pitcher, desperately trying to calm the frantic, hammering rhythm in her chest. She had been waiting for a moment like this for 9 long years. For 9 years, she had been hiding. For 9 years, she had been changing her identity. For 9 years, she had carried her father's final letter, a constant weight, like a curse, pressed against her ribs. And now, the son of her greatest enemy was sitting less than 20 feet away from her. Table 7 needs their water glasses filled. Philip's voice, directly behind her, made Nora jump. And try not to spill anything this time. This is a very important guest. Do you understand me? Nora gave a silent nod and began walking toward the private room, the heavy pitcher in her hand. Each step was a monumental effort, as if her feet were made of lead. She could feel the small, sharp knife hidden securely inside her boot, the one weapon she never went anywhere without. But she was not here to end a life. Not on this day. She only needed to know. She needed to see with her own eyes the man who carried the blood of the person who had completely shattered her family. The private room felt like an entirely different world. A massive crystal chandelier bathed a polished oak table in a warm golden light. 4 men were seated around it, but only one of them truly dominated the space. Ezra Thornton sat with his back to the door, leaning casually in his chair with one hand resting on the tabletop. 2 of his bodyguards stood just behind him, their eyes methodically and constantly scanning the area. The other 2 men were seated on either side of Ezra. One was older, with silver hair and the calculating eyes of a seasoned fox. The other was younger, maybe around 45, with sharp, angular features and a gaze as cold as steel. The silver-haired man was Gerald Whitmore, a face she recognized instantly from the many photographs she had studied. He had been the Thornton family's financial advisor for over 30 years. The other man had to be Silas Monroe, Ezra's most trusted enforcer, the one who was rumored to handle all the messy business his boss preferred not to touch. Nora approached the table with her head lowered and her shoulders slightly hunched, perfectly mimicking the posture of a servant who wants to remain unnoticed. She started to pour water into the first empty glass, her hand perfectly steady. 9 years of living in the shadows had taught her how to control every single muscle in her body. The shipment that arrived from the port is short by 20%. Gerald Whitmore's voice was quiet, but it was clear enough for Nora to overhear. Someone is skimming off the top. I am aware. Ezra's voice was low and deliberate, like the sound of stones rolling at the bottom of a river. The real question is who it is and why they believe they will live through this. Nora poured water into the second glass, making sure her hand never touched anything, except for the pitcher and the glass. She could not afford any trouble. She was here for information, and only information. There are only 3 people with access to the shipping schedules. Silas Monroe spoke, and his voice was as sharp as a newly honed razor. Raymond, Dimitri, and Chen. One of them is the rat. It cannot be Raymond, Ezra stated with certainty. He has been with me since I was 23 years old. That kind of loyalty cannot be bought with money. Nora moved closer to where Ezra was sitting. The pitcher tilted just slightly in her hand. She concentrated on the task of pouring, but her mind was a recorder, capturing every single detail. A traitor was operating inside the Thornton organization. That was very interesting. It was information that could be very useful later. And then her hand slipped. It was a tiny movement, just 1 centimeter, but it was enough for her wrist to brush against the back of Ezra's hand, which was resting on the table. His reaction was as fast as a lightning strike. Ezra's hand shot up, clamping around her wrist with the crushing force of an iron vice. Nora gasped a sharp intake of breath, and nearly dropped the heavy glass pitcher. The two bodyguards moved forward in perfect sync, their hands already reaching inside their suit jackets for their weapons. Silas Monroe jumped to his feet, his chair screeching loudly against the hardwood floor. But Ezra was not looking at any of them. He was staring intently at her hand. Nora felt the blood drain from her face as she understood what was happening. Ezra Thornton was examining the calluses on her palm, the toughened skin that had been formed by thousands of hours of firearms training, knife handling, and relentless combat drills. He was looking at the scar, a thin white line that ran along her index finger, a memento from the first time she had disassembled her father's Glock when she was only 14 and carelessly cut herself. These are not the hands of a waitress. Ezra's voice was so low that it was almost a whisper, but every single word sliced through the air like a blade. His gaze slowly traveled up from her hand to meet hers. His gray eyes met her brown ones. It was ice meeting a hidden, smoldering fire. Nora did not flinch. She had stood her ground against killers, against smugglers, against absolute monsters who wore human skin. She would not allow Harrison Thornton's son to be the one to make her tremble. "I wash dishes for 12 hours a day before they ever let me serve the tables," she said, her tone perfectly even. Her voice was as calm and still as deep water. "My hands are not as delicate as the hands of the wealthy ladies, you know." Several seconds stretched on, feeling like an eternity. Silas Monroe was still standing, his hand now partially drawing the pistol that was concealed beneath his jacket. Gerald Whitmore observed everything with his cunning, fox-like eyes, not missing a single detail. And Ezra Thornton still had her wrist in his grip, his fingers pressing lightly against the calluses as if he were reading a secret language written on her skin. Then, he finally let her go. "Be more careful next time," Ezra said, his tone completely unchanged. "Spilling water on a guest in a restaurant like this would certainly cost you your job." Nora took a step back, lowering her head just enough to show respect. "I am very sorry, sir. It will not happen again." She turned and walked away. Her heart was still pounding like a war drum against her ribs, but her face remained a perfect, blank mask. She could feel the intensity of Ezra Thornton's gaze burning into her back until she was safely past the velvet curtain of the private room. He did not believe a word she had said. That much was obvious, but he also had not ordered his guards to seize her. Not yet, anyway. Nora went back to the service corner and placed the pitcher on the counter, her hands only now beginning to shake, just slightly. She had been careless. After 9 years of hiding, she had almost given herself away because of one accidental touch. But there was a part of her, a part she had tried to bury a long time ago, that felt something entirely different. When their eyes had met, she had not only seen suspicion in Ezra's gaze, she had also seen a flicker of curiosity, and she knew that curiosity was 1,000 times more dangerous than simple suspicion could ever be. From the relative safety of the service corner, Nora kept watching the private room through a very narrow gap in the curtain. The meeting continued, and she kept listening intently because she had learned one very important lesson over the past 9 years. The most dangerous enemy you will ever face is not the one you can see coming. It is the one you never expect. And somewhere in that room, among those powerful men and their hidden weapons, a rat was hiding. Nora just needed to figure out who it was before that rat discovered her. An hour went by. The restaurant slowly filled with more guests, and the sound of their laughter mixed with the clinking of silverware, creating the familiar, pleasant symphony of a normal evening at the Crimson Orchid. But Nora could not shake the deep feeling of unease that was gnawing at every one of her nerves. She stood near the bar, making a show of rearranging clean glasses, while her eyes were constantly scanning the entire room. Ezra Thornton's private room remained sealed off behind its heavy curtains, but every now and then, a quiet laugh would drift out. That was a rare sound from the man she had been observing for a full hour. She noticed that one of the two bodyguards was now bent over his phone, while the other was signaling for her to bring them the check. They had started to relax. The comfort of good food and expensive wine had begun to dull their natural survival instincts. It was a fatal mistake, and Nora knew this because her father's greatest lesson was that death is a coward. It never arrives when you are watching for it. It comes when your guard is down, when laughter fills your lungs, when you let yourself believe that everything might just be okay. The front door of the restaurant swung open. Nora glanced up from pure habit, and a deep, ancestral cold seized her from the inside out. 4 men stepped into the warmth, their long black coats glistening with a fine mist of rain. They ignored Philip as he approached them with a practiced, welcoming smile. They did not pause at the host stand to wait for a table. They moved past the waiting area and into the dining room with the absolute certainty of men who believe the world belongs to them. But that was not what made Nora's blood feel like slush in her veins. It was their formation, a perfect diamond, with 1 man leading, 2 acting as flanks, and a 4th guarding the rear. The space between each of them was precisely 2 steps. Their shoulders were angled forward, their centers of gravity kept low, bodies coiled and ready to explode into action at any moment. These were soldiers or professional killers. Nora had been forced to watch this exact approach in hundreds of training videos, her father replaying them relentlessly until the patterns were burned into her mind, recognizable even in her dreams. And she saw immediately that the bottoms of their long coats were left unbuttoned. It was for quick, easy access to their hips and to the weapons holstered there. Their path was direct and unwavering, leading straight toward the private room in the back. In that instant, time itself seemed to thicken and slow down around her. Nora knew this feeling well. It was the chilling sensation that came just before violence. The world became a slow-motion film, every single detail magnified into painful focus. She saw the lead man's hand disappear inside his coat. She saw the soft glint of dull black metal under the light of the crystal chandelier, the unmistakable shape of a suppressor. She saw that his index finger was not just near the trigger, but already resting upon it as he walked. And then her eyes darted to the private room. Inside, Ezra Thornton sat with his back partially exposed to the doorway, sharing a laugh with Gerald Whitmore over some unheard joke. One of his bodyguards was completely absorbed in his phone, his head down. The second guard had turned his back to the room, trying to flag down a server to settle the check. They had maybe 60 seconds left, and likely much less. That was the remaining window of time before 4 suppressed pistols would fill that room with quiet, deadly fire and leave every person inside as a lifeless body on the expensive carpet. Nora had no time for conscious thought. There was no time to analyze why it mattered to her if the son of her sworn enemy lived or died. There was certainly no time to remember the solemn vow she had made to see the Thornton family utterly destroyed, even if it took her last breath. Her body simply reacted, moving faster than her mind could raise an objection. She screamed the word, "Gun!" The sound ripped from her throat, erupting into the peaceful restaurant with the raw, compressed force of 9 long years spent in survival mode. For a single, frozen heartbeat, the entire restaurant went silent and still. And then, all hell broke loose. The lead assassin spun to face Nora, his weapon already coming up, but the raw surprise of her shout had cost him a critical fraction of a second. A fraction was all it took. Inside the private room, Ezra Thornton moved like a dormant predator suddenly awakened. He violently twisted his body to the side, one powerful hand grabbing the heavy edge of the solid oak dining table. His two bodyguards also began to move, but they were fatally slow, much too slow. The sound was soft, like two quick coughs. Thip, thip. The first guard crumpled to the floor with a perfect, neat hole drilled between his eyebrows. Brain and bone matter sprayed across the classic oil painting on the wall behind him. The second man managed to reach for his own weapon, but a bullet tore through his throat before he could raise it. A fine mist of blood erupted from the wound as he collapsed forward onto the table, sending wine glasses and porcelain plates crashing to the floor with a sound that shattered the air. Utter chaos consumed the dining room. Guests began screaming, flipping over tables in a desperate panic, and shoving each other toward the back exit in a human stampede. The manager, Philip Hartwell, dropped flat onto the polished floor, his hands clamped over his head as he whimpered like a wounded dog. Nora, however, saw none of it. Her entire focus was locked on the unfolding scene in the private room. Ezra had managed to heave the massive oak table onto its side, creating a makeshift shield. He was desperately reaching for the firearm that had fallen from his dead guard's hand, but the four assassins had already fanned out, creating a deadly killing box that sealed him off from every possible angle. Silas Monroe was lying flat on the floor, motionless. Gerald Whitmore was cowering pathetically behind an upholstered chair, and Ezra Thornton, known as the most powerful and feared boss on the entire West Coast, was now trapped against the wall like a cornered animal. He was completely unarmed. He had checked his personal firearm with his coat when he arrived. It was a sign of respect, a professional courtesy that had just become a fatal error. Nora watched as the lead assassin took a deliberate step forward, his weapon aimed directly at the center of Ezra's chest. She saw the man's finger begin to tighten on the trigger, moving with the slow, arrogant confidence of someone who knows the fight is already won. And in that moment, she ran. She did not run away from the danger. She ran straight toward it. Her feet flew across the slick marble floor, her body staying low to the ground. 9 years of pure survival instinct, screaming commands to every muscle. Her eyes fixed on the gun lying on the overturned table. The weapon dropped by the dead guard, now resting in a rapidly spreading pool of dark blood on the polished oak. She executed a perfect slide across the floor, her hand snatching the pistol's grip. Her finger curled around the trigger, as if it were an extension of her own body, as if she had performed this exact action 1,000 times before. And in a way, she had. She had done it in brutal training sessions with her father, in the long and sleepless nights spent alone in a run-down rented room, and in the recurring nightmares from which she would jolt awake. Her hand clenched into a fist, gripping a gun that wasn't there. She pivoted on her knee, raised the weapon in a single fluid motion, locked her aim, and she pulled the trigger. 3 shots rang out, so close together they sounded like one. 3 of the assassins hit the floor almost simultaneously. One was struck through the chest, another through the throat, and the third through the temple. The fourth and final man spun around to face Nora, his eyes wide with disbelief and shock, his own gun starting to lift and aim at her. But Ezra was much faster. He exploded forward from behind the overturned table, his hands clamping onto the last assassin's head with brutal force. He twisted violently, and the sound of bone cracking was dry and sickeningly loud, like a thick tree branch being bent past its breaking point. The assassin crumpled into a heap, his neck bent at an angle that was completely unnatural. A profound silence descended upon the room. Nora remained in the wreckage, the gun still raised, a thin curl of smoke rising from its barrel. She could hear the faint screams of guests still crowding the back exit, the distant, mournful wail of police sirens growing louder somewhere in the city, and the frantic hammering of her own heart against her ribs. But she could not hear the sound of her own breathing, because she had completely forgotten to breathe. Ezra Thornton slowly, deliberately pushed himself to his full height. His cold, steel-gray eyes were locked on her, never leaving her face for even a second. Dark spatters of his guard's blood stained his expensive vest, but he made no move to wipe them away. He simply stood there and stared at her, as if she were an impossible puzzle that had no solution. "Who are you?" The words were not a question. They were a command for information. Nora finally lowered the heavy gun, but she did not release her grip. Her finger remained on the trigger guard, ready to act if she had to. She had just killed 3 men in less than 2 seconds. Killing one more would not cost her any sleep. "I'm the person who just saved your life," she answered, and her voice was steady, almost frighteningly calm. Ezra took a step toward her, and each footstep on the floor sounded like the beat of a war drum. Behind him, Gerald Whitmore stayed curled behind his chair, shaking like a leaf in the wind. Silas Monroe had managed to get back to his feet, his face ashen white, but his eyes as cold as chips of ice. His gaze was fixed on Nora with a look of undisguised suspicion. "You shoot like a trained sniper," Silas said, his voice raw and hoarse. 3 moving targets, in low light, in under 2 seconds. That is not the work of a waitress. Ezra came to a stop less than a single step away from Nora. The air between them was thick with tension. She could smell his expensive cologne, now mingled with the acrid scents of gunpowder and fresh blood. She could see the strong tendons in his neck pulled taut with rage. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles twitched just beneath his skin. He was furious. It was not because he had been attacked, but because he had been forced to accept salvation from a woman he could not comprehend. "Give me the gun," Ezra said, holding out a large, steady hand. Nora looked down at it. It was the same powerful hand that had just snapped a man's neck as if it were a toothpick. It was the hand of a killer. But then, she had just killed 3 men herself. She was in no position to pass judgment. She placed the heavy pistol into Ezra's open palm, turning it so he could take the grip first. It was a gesture of trust, but it was a trust she did not feel at all. Ezra accepted the weapon, his intense gaze never once breaking from hers. For one terrifying moment, she thought he might just shoot her right there on the spot. She wondered if this was how her story was meant to end, on a blood-soaked restaurant floor, at the hands of the son of the very man she had sworn to destroy. Just then, the back door of the restaurant burst open. Raymond Walsh charged in with his gun already drawn, followed closely by 4 more men in black suits, reinforcements from the convoy that had been waiting outside. Raymond's eyes swept across the room, quickly counting the bodies on the floor. He then looked at Ezra, his expression a mixture of profound relief and abject horror. "Sir, the police will be here in 3 minutes," he said urgently. "We need to leave, right now." Ezra gave a slight nod, but his eyes remained locked on Nora. "You are coming with us," he stated. Nora did not move a muscle. "I do not think that is necessary," she replied. "That was not a question," Ezra cut in, his voice as cold and hard as steel. Raymond moved to Nora's side, placing a hand on her shoulder, with just enough firm pressure to make it perfectly clear that she had no other choice. She could have tried to resist. She could have attempted to run, but she was surrounded by 6 heavily armed men inside a restaurant now filled with corpses, and the sound of the sirens was growing louder with each passing second. She was not a fool. Nora allowed Raymond to guide her through the back door and into a dark alley where black Escalades were waiting, their powerful engines already running. The relentless Seattle rain continued to fall, cold and without mercy, washing the blood from her hands as she crossed the wet pavement. She was pushed into the middle vehicle, where she found herself sitting directly opposite Silas Monroe and a still shaking Gerald Whitmore. Ezra sat down beside her, his massive frame taking up nearly all the remaining space. The heavy door slammed shut, and the convoy immediately surged into motion, leaving the Crimson Orchid restaurant behind to be swallowed by the flashing red and blue lights of the arriving police cars. Inside the vehicle, nobody spoke for the first 2 minutes. The only sounds were the steady drumming of rain against the windows and the low growl of the engine as the driver expertly navigated the city streets. Finally, Silas Monroe broke the silence, his voice like the scrape of a razor across shabby rough skin. "Who trained you to do that, Nora?" Simply stared out the window. Watching as the streetlights slid across her face like passing ghosts, she did not provide an answer. Silas leaned forward, his intensity growing. 3 shots, 3 kills. Nobody learns to shoot like that without serious professional training. Are you with the CIA, the FSB, or are you some kind of freelance mercenary? There was only silence. Nora could feel Ezra's eyes on her from the corner of her vision, but he said nothing at all. He was waiting, observing with the patience of a predator, allowing its cornered prey to reveal itself. "Who sent you here?" Silas pressed on, his voice growing sharper. "Was it Kozlov and the Bratva? Or are you an asset that was planted by the traitor inside our own organization?" Nora remained completely still and silent. She began to count her breaths. 1, 2, 3. She mentally noted every turn the car made, memorizing the route in case she found an opportunity to run. She refused to look at Silas. She refused to look at Ezra. She just watched the rain slide down the glass and thought about the letter from her father. It was lying in the shabby, cheap room that she might now never see again. The name Thornton echoed in her head like a funeral bell. She had just saved the life of a Thornton. She wondered what her father would think if he knew what she had done. Silas opened his mouth to ask another question, but Ezra simply raised one hand. It was a small, almost casual gesture, yet Silas instantly fell silent. "She will talk," Ezra said, his voice low and filled with absolute certainty. Eventually, low and firm. When our car pulled up, Nora kept her gaze forward, but she knew he was watching her from his own vehicle. She could feel his stare like the cold, flat edge of a blade resting on the back of her neck. A silent threat, waiting for the perfect moment to press deeper. After about 40 minutes on the main road, the convoy of cars veered away from the highway. They traveled down a narrow, winding path that was completely surrounded by towering cedar trees, their branches so thick they swallowed the moonlight whole, plunging the world into darkness. Nora committed every single detail to her memory. They were 23 kilometers northeast of downtown Seattle. There were 3 separate checkpoints staffed with armed guards. An imposing iron fence that stood more than 3 meters tall was topped with spikes dipped in gold. Security cameras were mounted every 50 meters. This place was not a home. It was a fortress designed to keep the world out. The Thornton estate finally came into view after one last curve in the road, and Nora had to fight with all her might to keep the shock from registering on her face. Before her stood a castle built in the Tudor style, its walls made of imposing gray stone. It featured dark, black-tiled roofs, and dozens of windows glowed with a warm light, appearing like a multitude of watchful eyes peering out into the oppressive darkness. The front grounds alone were larger than the entire apartment complex, where she had spent a part of her life, and it was complete with an elegant marble fountain and rose bushes that were trimmed to absolute perfection. This place was built from three things: money, immense power, and the blood of others. The line of cars came to a halt right before the main gate. Raymond opened her door, and Nora carefully stepped out onto the gravel drive. The rain had finally stopped, but the air was still heavy with a damp chill, as if the entire city was collectively holding its breath in anticipation. She immediately began to scan her surroundings, her eyes moving with the practiced efficiency of a soldier assessing a new battlefield. She counted 12 guards that were clearly visible, which meant there were likely twice that many concealed in the deep shadows. There were 3 possible escape routes, but all of them were under the constant watch of surveillance cameras. The windows on the second floor looked like they could be reached with a good rope. The eastern wall was noticeably lower than the others, maybe by about half a meter. She had no immediate plans to run, not yet anyway, but a habit built over 9 years of hiding and looking over her shoulder was not something that disappeared easily. Ezra emerged from the rear vehicle. The vest he wore, once stained with blood, had been replaced by a clean black coat that someone must have given him during the drive. He did not even glance in Nora's direction. Instead, he walked directly toward the massive front door, his stride confident and purposeful, like a man who owned every inch of the ground he walked on. He issued an order without turning his head. "Take her up to my study." Then he added, "And call Dr. Coleman to come take a look at Gerald's injury." Raymond gave a slight nod. He gently placed a hand on the small of Nora's back, a subtle pressure guiding her to follow Ezra. Silas Monroe fell into step right behind her. She could feel his breath on her neck, a constant and chilling reminder that her every single move was being closely observed. Inside, the mansion was somehow even more imposing and grand. The main hall featured a ceiling that soared more than 10 meters into the air, from which a massive crystal chandelier hung like a frozen star. A magnificent marble staircase curved gracefully up toward the second floor. The walls were lined with large oil paintings, most of them depicting serene European landscapes or portraits of stern-faced men with cold, calculating eyes. She guessed they were the Thornton ancestors, the very men who had constructed this sprawling empire upon the broken bones of other people. They were led down a long corridor with gleaming, polished oak floors. They made a left turn and finally stopped in front of a heavy, ornate mahogany door. Raymond pulled it open and then stepped aside, holding it for her. Nora walked through the doorway, and the feeling was like stepping directly into the den of a dangerous predator. Ezra Thornton's private study was as large as the entire apartment Nora had once paid for. Towering shelves filled with ancient-looking books stretched from the floor all the way to the high ceiling. A large desk made of black walnut wood was positioned in front of a wide glass window that provided a view of the rear garden. A stone fireplace was burning brightly nearby, its flames leaping and dancing, casting long ghostly shadows that moved across the walls. And there, on the wall, directly opposite the door, hanging prominently above the fireplace, was a massive oil portrait. Nora froze in place. Her heart seemed to stop for a moment, then it slammed against her ribs with such a violent force that she thought it might actually burst right out of her chest. The painting showed a man who looked to be in his early 60s. He had silver hair, streaked with gray, sharp facial features, and a cold, arrogant expression in his eyes. He was dressed in a tailored black suit and stood before a window with one hand resting casually on the back of a chair. It was the posture of a king surveying his vast kingdom. Harrison Thornton. She knew that face instantly. She had spent 9 long years studying that face, burning every single line and shadow into her memory. She had stood at her father's grave and sworn an oath that she would hunt down and completely destroy the bloodline of the man responsible for his death. And now, at this very moment, she was standing inside the home of his son, just after she had saved the life of the very same man she had dedicated her life to killing. That is my father. Ezra's voice cut through the silence from behind her, causing Nora to spin around sharply. He was standing beside a liquor cabinet, carefully pouring amber whiskey into two heavy crystal glasses. Harrison Thornton passed away 5 years ago. It was lung cancer. He gestured with his head toward an armchair that was positioned opposite the desk. Sit down. Nora remained standing. She stood perfectly still, her eyes darting back and forth between the portrait on the wall and Ezra, desperately trying to control the powerful storm of emotions that was rising up inside her. There was hatred, there was pain, and there was something else entirely, a feeling she did not dare to give a name. I already told you to sit. Ezra placed one of the glasses of whiskey on the desk, directly in front of where she would be sitting. His statement was not a request. Nora stared at the glass for a long moment, then slowly raised her gaze to meet his. It was a mistake, because the instant their eyes locked, she understood that Ezra Thornton was not just asking a simple question about who she was. He was attempting to peer directly into her soul. She finally sat down, not because she was obeying him, but because her legs suddenly felt as if they could no longer bear her own weight. Ezra settled into the chair across from her, holding his own glass of whiskey. The flickering firelight from the hearth illuminated one side of his face, casting it in shifting, dancing shadows. In that particular moment, he bore a disturbing resemblance to the man in the portrait. You handle a gun like someone who has fired it thousands upon thousands of times, Ezra began, his voice deliberate and controlled. You move with the efficiency of someone who has had extensive military training, and your hands have calluses that no waitress should ever have. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his focus entirely on her. So, I am going to ask you one more time. Who are you? Nora reached out and lifted the whiskey glass, not because she had any desire to drink, but because she desperately needed a moment to gather her thoughts. She could easily lie. She could invent a convincing story about a past in military service, or years working for a private security company, anything at all that would explain her skills without revealing the dangerous truth. But she was exhausted. She felt a bone-deep weariness that came from 9 years on the run, 9 years of constant lies, 9 years of hiding who she was, and 9 years of carrying her hatred like a heavy stone tied securely around her neck. And maybe, just maybe, tonight was the night to finally let that stone go. My father was a mercenary, she said, and her own calm, steady voice was a surprise even to her. He started teaching me how to shoot a gun when I was 10 years old. He taught me how to fight when I was 12, and he taught me how to survive when he finally understood that this world has no room for the weak. Ezra did not move a muscle. He did not react at all. He just waited for her to continue. He died when I was 19, Nora went on, her eyes now fixed on the portrait of Harrison Thornton. He was on a job in Beirut. He was left behind by his team, betrayed by the one man that he trusted more than anyone else. She lowered her gaze from the painting and looked directly at Ezra. My father's name was Jack Sinclair. Ezra's reaction was so incredibly subtle that most people would have missed it completely. But Nora had dedicated 9 years of her life to watching people, to reading them, to searching for the slightest, most insignificant signs of a lie. She saw the muscle in his jaw tighten, almost imperceptibly. She saw his pupils dilate just a fraction of a millimeter. She saw his fingers momentarily stop their movement on the rim of his glass. He recognized that name. Sinclair. Ezra repeated the name quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Jack Sinclair. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes then, and it was not surprise. It was recognition. And maybe, just maybe, there was a hint of guilt there as well. He knows, Nora thought to herself, and the hatred surged through her with such a ferocious intensity that she had to clench her teeth together to stop herself from screaming out loud. He knows exactly what his father did, and he still lives in this grand mansion. He drinks this expensive whiskey, and he walks around as if he owns the entire world. So, that is it. Ezra set his glass down on the table, his movements slow and deliberate. You came here with the intention of killing me. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a conclusion he had reached. Nora did not bother to deny it. She just stared at him, letting the heavy silence in the room speak for her. And in that firelit study, with the portrait of Harrison Thornton looming over them like a ghost from a painful past, two sworn enemies sat across from one another, each of them carrying deep scars that the other could not possibly see. Ezra remained silent for such a long time that Nora started to believe he was about to call for his guards to come in and have her shot right there on the spot. But instead, he slowly rose from his chair, walked back over to the liquor cabinet, and poured himself another glass of whiskey. This one was not for her. It was only for him. He drank the entire glass in a single, swift swallow. He stood there with his back turned to her, his gaze fixed on his father's portrait. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was different. It was no longer cold and in control. It was deeper now, and much heavier, as if each and every word he spoke carried the immense weight of secrets that had been buried for far too long. My father was a monster, Ezra said, his back still to her. I knew it even when I was a small child. I saw the way he treated my mother. I watched how he utterly destroyed anyone who was brave enough to stand in his way. I saw how he built this entire empire on the blood and suffering of other people and had the audacity to call it business. Nora did not move. She did not trust him. She could not bring herself to trust him. But she listened intently, because this was the very truth that she had been desperately searching for over 9 long years, a truth that had always been just out of her reach. Beirut. Ezra continued, his hand still gripping the now empty glass so tightly his knuckles were white. I knew about what happened there. Not right away, of course. My father was exceptionally good at hiding his actions, at reducing everything to mere numbers on a page, to lifeless corporate reports that spoke of failed operations and unforeseen financial losses. He finally turned to face her, and in his eyes, Nora witnessed something she never anticipated. It was a profound exhaustion, a soul-deep weariness that suggested he had carried this terrible secret for far too long, and it was now crushing him from within. He began to speak. I discovered his private journal 2 years ago. Ezra's voice was low. After he passed away, I was clearing out his old study, getting ready to take command of the family business. That is when I found a hidden safe, concealed behind a painting in his bedroom. Inside, there were ledgers, incriminating documents, and a journal written in his own hand. He stopped, swallowing with immense difficulty, as if the next words were the most painful he would ever utter. Beirut was not a failed mission. It was an intentional act of betrayal. My own father sold out the entire team just to save a single shipment. 6 men. They were fathers, husbands, and sons. He allowed them to be sacrificed like insignificant pieces on a chessboard. And Jack was one of them. Sinclair, your father, was one of them. The words felt as if someone had landed a powerful punch directly into Nora's chest. She had always known that her father had been betrayed. She had known for years that Harrison Thornton was the one responsible. But to hear the truth confirmed so plainly, spoken aloud by his own son, was a devastating blow she had not been prepared for. She shot to her feet so quickly that the armchair she was in crashed backward onto the floor. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the white-hot fury that was now boiling through her veins. "He knew," she said, her voice a low hiss through her clenched teeth. "He knew what happened, and you did absolutely nothing. You just continued to live in this mansion, enjoying the money and the power that was built on my father's stolen life. And you did nothing at all." Ezra did not back away from her rage. He stood his ground, absorbing every single word she threw at him, as if it were a punishment he fully deserved. "I did do something," he said, his voice quiet and filled with weariness. "I have been. I dedicated the past 2 years to locating the families of the men who were lost in that operation. I succeeded with 5 of the 6. I arranged for them to receive money, sent from an untraceable source. It was not an act of atonement, because my father's crimes are beyond redemption. It was simply the only action I could take." He fixed his gaze directly on Nora. "The one family I was unable to trace was Jackson Clare's. Records showed he had a wife, now deceased, and a daughter. But 9 years ago, that daughter completely disappeared from every official document, as if she had ceased to exist entirely." The floor felt like it was falling away from under Nora's feet. He had actually searched for her. He had made an effort to locate her. For what purpose? To offer an apology? To try and purchase his redemption with cash, as if her father's entire existence was something that could be bought and sold? "Do not ever expect me to forgive you," she said, her voice trembling with the effort of the control. "Your money is worthless here. It cannot buy you forgiveness. Nothing you do ever will. I am not asking you for forgiveness," Ezra replied, and his voice was suddenly, unexpectedly softer. "I have not earned it. No one from the Thornton family has." He moved toward her, closing the distance until they stood less than an arm's length apart. "But I will tell you this. I am not my father. I do not abandon the people who depend on me. I do not betray the trust of those loyal to me. And as of tonight, I have a powerful enemy actively trying to end my life. I have a traitor operating from within my own organization, and I have a woman who chose to save me, even when she possessed every reason in the world to watch me die." He angled his head, and the firelight seemed to ignite in his gray eyes. "So I must ask you, Nora Sinclair, what were your reasons for saving my life?" Nora's mouth opened, ready to respond, yet no words emerged, because she possessed no clear answer. She had no idea why she had moved on pure instinct instead of allowing the assassin to eliminate her sworn enemy. She could not explain why in that critical instant she had chosen preservation over letting destiny take its final violent course. Perhaps it was because her father had raised her to believe that all life is sacred, regardless of whose it is. Maybe she refused to become the same kind of monster that Harrison Thornton had been. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because when she had stared into Ezra Thornton's eyes at the restaurant, she had not seen his father at all. She had seen an entirely different man looking back. The door flew open with a violent crash, completely destroying the charged silence between them. Silas Monroe rushed into the room. His face was a mask of pale stress, and his normally icy eyes were now alight with something that looked like genuine concern. "Sir, we have it confirmed," he said, out of breath as if he had sprinted from the other side of the vast estate. "Our contact inside the Bratva just verified it. The assassination attempt tonight was ordered directly by Victor Klov." Ezra turned his body, the deep exhaustion in his eyes instantly replaced by an expression far more chilling and dangerous. Klav, he repeated, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. So that Russian has finally decided to reveal his true intentions. He was not acting alone, Silas went on, shooting a tired, wary look in Nora's direction. Someone from inside our organization provided him with the necessary information. Your exact schedule for tonight, the positions of the guards, every single detail. So the rat you have been hunting, Nora stated with a surprising calm. This is not just about skimming from shipments. This person wants you dead. Ezra's attention snapped back to her, a brief flicker of genuine curiosity crossing his features. He then gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if he had just arrived at a final, critical decision. She is staying, he informed Silas. It was not a suggestion. It was an unbreakable command. Prepare a room for her in the East Wing, and from this moment forward, she is to have unrestricted access throughout the estate. Silas looked completely stunned. Sir, she confessed that she came to this place with the intention of killing you. She is the daughter of— I am well aware of who she is, Ezra interrupted, his voice turning as cold and hard as steel. And I am also aware that she was given a perfect opportunity to let me die tonight and made the choice not to. In my world, that action makes her more worthy of my trust than the majority of people inside this house. He redirected his focus to Nora, their gray and brown eyes locking in another charged exchange. It appears we now have a common adversary, Miss Sinclair, and I have a strong feeling that your particular set of skills will prove to be extremely valuable in the days that are coming. Nora did not fully understand her own actions when she gave a small nod of agreement. She had no idea what kind of treacherous path she was committing to by consenting to remain in the heart of her enemy's territory. But she was certain of one thing. The entire game had just been fundamentally altered, and she was no longer sure what set of rules she was supposed to be playing by. 3 full days passed within the confines of the Thornton estate, and Nora used most of that time for intense observation. She watched the household staff, who moved through the halls like silent, invisible ghosts. She watched the security teams rotate their shifts every 8 hours, with a minimum of 12 guards on duty at all times. She watched Raymond Walsh make his direct report to Ezra each morning, his loyalty as fierce and obvious as that of a well-trained guard dog. And most intently, she watched Silas Monroe. There was something profoundly wrong with that man. Nora could not define it with any certainty, but her survival instincts, honed over 9 long years, screamed a silent warning every single time he walked into a room. It was an accumulation of minor details, the kind of things most people would never notice. The way Silas checked his phone with obsessive frequency, always carefully angling the screen away from any nearby eyes. The subtle way his posture would stiffen whenever Ezra brought up the subject of finding the traitor. The way he would vanish for short periods of time, offering no explanation or official report of his whereabouts. And most of all, it was the way he now looked at Nora. The suspicion was gone, replaced by something that was much closer to fear, as if he suspected she was seeing right through him to something he desperately wanted to keep hidden. On the evening of the 3rd day, Ezra called for a meeting in his private study. Silas, Raymond, Gerald Whitmore, and 3 other men Nora had never seen before were all seated around the long, polished conference table. She had been invited to take a seat in the corner of the room, positioned as an observer, not a participant. We have acquired new intelligence on Klav, Ezra started, his voice detached and professional. He is arranging a meeting with his partners from Moscow sometime next week. This will be our best opportunity to make a move. Nora pretended to listen to the strategic discussion that followed, but her eyes remained fixed on Silas. She saw at the exact moment Ezra mentioned the specific date and time for the proposed meeting. Silas's hand made a sudden, almost imperceptible twitch in the direction of his pocket, where she knew his phone was resting. It was only a flicker of a movement, a tiny, involuntary action. But it was more than enough confirmation for her. The rat was not Raymond. It was not Chin or Dmitri, as some had apparently suspected. The traitor was the man sitting at Ezra Thornton's right hand, a man who had supposedly served him with loyalty for 15 years. The meeting concluded after an hour had passed. One by one, the other men began to file out of the study, but Nora remained in her chair. She waited patiently until she and Ezra were the only two people left in the room. The firelight from the hearth was casting long, dancing shadows across the paneled walls. She could have spoken, but in a house that could easily be monitored with listening devices, words were a dangerous and unnecessary risk. Instead, Nora rose from her chair and walked over to Ezra's large desk. She picked up a pen and a clean sheet of paper. Ezra observed her every move, his gray eyes narrowing with a sharp curiosity. She wrote down just 3 words, then carefully turned the paper so he could see it. Silas is the rat. Ezra read the message. His face remained a perfect, unreadable mask. Only the tightening of his jaw, for a fraction of a second, gave away the powerful fury that was boiling just beneath his calm exterior. He reached out and took the pen from her hand, writing a single word beneath her accusation. Proof. Nora accepted the pen back from him and wrote again, her handwriting steady. Phone, glances whenever traitor is mentioned. Hand moves to pocket when hears sensitive information. Disappears without explanation. Ezra read her words and then looked up to meet her gaze. In his eyes, she saw something she had not anticipated at all. Respect. He wrote one more word on the paper. Bait. Nora nodded in understanding and added to their silent conversation. Feed Silas false information. Location. Time. Only he knows. If Clov shows up, that is proof. Ezra stared down at the paper for a long, silent moment, the firelight highlighting the sharp angles of his face. Then he gave a slow nod, and a cold, truly dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. He took the pen and wrote the final line on the page, Pier 6, tomorrow night. Only Silas knows. Nora read his words and gave another firm nod. She understood the plan perfectly. If Victor Clov or any of his men made an appearance at Pier 6 the following night, it would serve as undeniable confirmation that Silas Monroe was the traitor they were hunting. Ezra took the sheet of paper, crumpled it into a tight ball, and tossed it directly into the fireplace. They both stood there in complete silence, watching as the flames licked at the edges of the paper, consuming their words and turning their crucial evidence into nothing but gray ash. When he finally turned back to face her, the look in his eyes had shifted once again, no longer just curiosity or suspicion, but something much deeper and far more perilous. You have a good eye, Ezra said, his voice a low rumble, like the growl of a patient predator. Your father trained you well. He taught me what I needed to know to survive, Nora replied, refusing to break his intense stare, including how to recognize the person who is planning to stab you in the back. Ezra tilted his head slightly. The firelight illuminated one half of his face in stark relief, creating an image of light and shadow like a Caravaggio painting. So, tell me, do you believe I will be the one to stab you in the back? Nora met his gaze head-on, without so much as a blink. I believe you will do whatever you deem necessary to protect what belongs to you. And at this particular moment, I do not represent a threat to that. A heavy charged moment hung in the air between them. Then Ezra gave a slow nod, as if she had just passed some critical test she had not even realized she was taking. Tomorrow night, he stated, you will be right there at my side. It was not a question, and it was not a request. It was a simple declaration of fact. And Nora, fully aware that she was voluntarily walking straight into the mouth of hell, nodded her consent. On the following evening, Ezra completely reversed his position and ordered Nora to remain at the estate. "It is far too dangerous," he said. "If this is a trap designed for Silas, it could just as easily become a trap for all of us." Nora gave a nod of agreement, her expression unreadable. She waited until the entire convoy of vehicles had rolled out through the main gates and the red glow of the Escalade's taillights had completely disappeared behind the thick line of cedar trees. Then she began to move. She had spent 3 days meticulously studying the guard schedules and knew with certainty that there was a 12-minute window between patrols when the southeast corner of the garage area was left entirely unwatched. She knew that the very last vehicle in the convoy, which was the equipment van, had a cargo door that could not be locked from the inside. And she knew that the drive to Pier 6 would take approximately 35 minutes. She moved through the encroaching darkness with the silent grace of a feral cat. She expertly avoided the bright sweeps of the security camera lights, bypassed the guards who were smoking near the side gate, and hoisted herself into the back of the van. She curled her body into a small space among the cold metal equipment cases and began to wait. The vehicle's engine rumbled to life 5 minutes later. Nora began to count the time inside her head. She felt every single turn the van made, every moment of acceleration, and every instance of slowing down. She counted her own breaths to keep her calm. 1, 2, 3. Her mind went back to her father and the way he had taught her the art of patience. He had shown her how to wait, how to make herself become a seamless part of the surrounding darkness. The most effective predator is not the one that is the fastest, he would often tell her. It is the one that understands precisely when to wait and exactly when to strike. The van finally came to a complete stop. She could hear the sound of doors opening, the heavy tread of boots on concrete, and the damp wind blowing in from the bay, carrying the distinct smells of salt and oil. She remained hidden for another 5 minutes, giving everyone time to move into their assigned positions. Then she carefully eased the heavy door open just enough to slip out. Pier 6, at night, was a confusing labyrinth of enormous, stacked shipping containers. The silent cranes overhead looked like the giant skeletons of prehistoric beasts. The darkness was so thick it was only broken by the faint, weak glow of yellow security lamps. A heavy fog was rolling in from the bay, swallowing everything that was more than 50 meters away. Nora moved into it. She moved like a phantom between the steel walls of the shipping containers, drawn by the distant murmur of voices and the sharp cuts of flashlight beams. Nora found her perch on top of a tall container, a perfect vantage point, giving her a clear view of the central yard while keeping her hidden in the deep shadows. Down below, Ezra stood with Raymond and 4 other guards. Their flashlights sliced through the damp, open air. Standing just a little away from the group was Silas Monroe, his hands buried in his pockets. His eyes darted around restlessly, betraying a nervousness he tried hard to conceal. 10 long minutes crawled by, then 20. The night remained quiet and still. Nothing was happening. Raymond's patience began to fray. He muttered that maybe the intelligence was bad, or perhaps Claude had sensed the trap. Ezra offered no reply. He remained as motionless as a stone statue, his gray eyes scanning the darkness with the infinite patience of a predator. And then, all at once, hell opened up. Headlights ignited from 3 different directions, their glare a blinding, artificial dawn. Engines roared to life, and from the swirling fog, dozens of armed figures emerged, their weapons already raised. Claude had not come alone. He had brought an entire army with him. The world exploded into gunfire. Bullets shrieked through the air, a deadly metal storm. The sound of rounds striking steel containers rang out like discordant bells. The night filled with the terrible sounds of screams and the choked cries of the wounded. Raymond immediately grabbed Ezra, pulling him to safety behind a massive container. He drew his own weapon and began returning fire. Two of their guards were cut down instantly, their blood spraying across the wet, dark concrete. From her hidden position, Nora pulled the Glock she had concealed at her waist. The firearm she had taken from her room before sneaking out into the night. She knew she did not have much ammunition, only 2 magazines, but she reasoned that she did not need much. She only needed enough to make it through this alive. She dropped silently from the container, moving through the chaotic battlefield like a ghost. She saw a gunman taking aim at Raymond, and without a second thought, she fired. The round tore through his shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground. She dodged a blistering burst of automatic fire, rolled across the pavement, and kept moving steadily toward Ezra. And that is when she saw it. Silas Monroe was not fighting on their side. He was slowly backing away from the fight, using the chaos as a perfect cover to move completely unseen. He was heading directly for Ezra, whose back was turned as he concentrated on the attackers charging from the front. In that moment, time seemed to stretch and slow down. Nora saw Silas pull his own gun from his coat. She saw him raise the barrel and carefully aim at the center of Ezra's back. She saw his finger begin to tighten on the trigger. She did not think. She only acted. She fired her weapon. The bullet punched through Silas's right shoulder, and the impact sent his gun flying from his grasp. He collapsed to the ground with a scream of agony, his left hand clamping down on the wound as blood poured out. Ezra spun around instantly, his gray eyes wide with shock, as he saw Silas writhing on the ground and the traitor's weapon lying just feet away. Then his gaze snapped up and found Nora, standing 10 meters away, her Glock still smoking in the dim light. In that single, frozen instant, the raging battle seemed to fade into the background, leaving only 3 people in the world: the traitor, the son of her enemy, and the woman who held the gun that could end both of their lives. "Who are you?" he hissed through teeth clenched in pain, his furious eyes locked on Nora. "She is the daughter of Jack Sinclair. Did you know that? She came here to put a bullet in you, not to save your life." Ezra remained perfectly still. He simply looked at Nora and waited, as if he wanted to see what she would do next. She understood she could shoot him right now. She had a perfect, clear shot. Silas was on the ground, no longer a threat. Raymond was occupied fighting somewhere else in the chaos. In the middle of this firefight, no one would ever know the truth. She could finally fulfill her father's last wish. She could end 9 long years of waiting with the pull of a single trigger. She raised the Glock again and leveled it at the center of Ezra's chest. He did not try to dodge. He did not beg for his life. He just stood there, looking directly at her with those gray eyes that held absolutely no trace of fear. She remembered her father, the quiet nights they spent by the fire, when he told her stories about the men he fought alongside. He spoke of honor, of loyalty, and about looking into another man's eyes and knowing the truth of who he really was. "My father did not kill men who had their backs turned," Nora said. Her voice trembled just a little, but her hand holding the gun remained as steady as a rock. "He did not kill men who were fighting to protect their own people." She slowly lowered the weapon. "Your father betrayed my father, but you are not him." Silas let out a harsh, rasping laugh that quickly turned into a bloody cough. He spat on the ground and told her she was a fool. Ezra still said nothing at all. He took a deliberate step toward Nora and then stopped, just an arm's length away from her. The headlights of a distant truck illuminated his face, and in that moment, she saw something in his eyes that she had never expected to see. It was not anger or suspicion. It was respect. And maybe, just maybe, it was also gratitude. The sounds of gunfire still echoed around them, mixed with screams, running feet, and the roar of engines. But for that brief moment, the two of them stood completely still, as if the entire world had frozen around them. "We have to get out of here," Ezra said, his voice low and urgent. He turned his head toward Silas, who was groaning on the ground, and shouted for Raymond to bind the traitor. He would answer for everything he had done. Then he turned back to face Nora and held out his hand to her. "Come with me." Nora stared at that outstretched hand, the hand that belonged to the son of her sworn enemy, the hand of the very man she had promised herself she would kill. And she took it. She took it because on that blood-soaked night, surrounded by dead bodies and gunfire, she made a conscious choice. She chose not to become the same kind of monster that Harrison Thornton had been. She chose forgiveness, not because she thought Ezra deserved it, but because she knew that she deserved to finally be free from all the hatred. They ran together through the maze of containers, dodging bullets and leaping over bodies, until they found a vehicle that was somehow still intact. Ezra got behind the wheel and drove, while Nora sat in the passenger seat, the Glock still held tightly in her hand. Behind them, Pier 6 was burning, a column of thick smoke rising into the night sky as the first wail of police sirens began to cut through the air. But they were already gone. As the glittering lights of the city grew closer, Nora knew that everything in her life had just changed forever. She was no longer the girl who was running from her past. She was now someone who chose to stand her ground and fight. The car sped through the deserted streets of Seattle, the overhead streetlights sliding across the windows like blurry, golden streaks. Nora did not ask where they were going. She was far too exhausted to even form the question. The adrenaline that had flooded her body was now gone, leaving behind a profound weariness and a dull, throbbing ache from the bullet that had grazed her left arm. It was an injury she had not even noticed until she felt the warm stickiness of blood seeping through the fabric of her sleeve. Ezra drove in a tense silence, his jaw clenched tightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead of them. He was injured too, with a cut on his forehead that was still bleeding, but he seemed completely indifferent to it. They eventually left the main road, turning onto a narrow, unpaved lane that led down toward a private, hidden dock. The yacht that was moored at the very end was not as large or as grand as Nora might have imagined. It was only about 12 meters long. Its white paint had yellowed with age, and patches of rust were blooming along the edges of the deck. This was not the lavish yacht of a billionaire. This was the quiet refuge of a man who understood that sometimes the only option was to disappear completely. "This is my safe place," Ezra said as he shut off the vehicle's engine. "Nobody knows about this place, not even Silas." They stepped out onto the dock, and when Nora's foot touched the wooden planks of the boat, she nearly collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Ezra caught her before she could fall, his arm wrapping around her waist with a gentleness she would never have expected from a man she had seen snap an enemy's neck with his bare hands just days before. He guided her carefully down into the lower cabin. It was a cramped space with just a single bunk, a small folding table, and a storage locker. The air inside was thick with the smells of engine oil and salty water. A single fluorescent light on the ceiling flickered a few times before it finally came on, casting a cold, sterile glow over the small room. "Sit down," Ezra ordered, his tone leaving no room for any argument. She obediently sat on the edge of the narrow bunk while he rummaged through the contents of the storage locker and pulled out an old, dusty first aid kit. He dragged a small, rickety chair over and sat down directly in front of her. He opened the kit and immediately got to work. "Take off your jacket," he commanded her. Nora tried to comply, but a sharp spike of pain made her hiss through her teeth. Ezra did not wait for her to struggle. He gently slid the jacket off her shoulder, exposing the arm where blood was still slowly seeping from the wound. The bullet had only grazed her. It had not lodged itself in her flesh, but the wound was deeper and more serious than she had first realized. "This is going to hurt," Ezra warned her, his voice low. He then poured antiseptic directly over the open wound. Nora clenched her jaw and refused to make a sound. She had certainly endured far worse than this. 9 long years of hardship had taught her how to swallow her pain, how to turn it into something that she could control. Ezra worked in complete silence, his large hands moving with an unexpected deftness as he skillfully wrapped a clean bandage around her injured arm. She watched him work, noticing the deep crease between his brows as he focused entirely on his task. She saw the dried blood on his own forehead that he still had not bothered to wipe away. "Why did you follow me tonight?" he asked, his eyes still fixed on the bandage. "Because I had a feeling you would need cover," she replied. "And because I am terrible at just sitting still and waiting." Ezra paused his work for a moment and finally looked up at her. The cold fluorescent light sharpened the angles of his face and made his gray eyes seem to search deep into hers. "You have saved my life 3 times in a single week," he said, speaking each word carefully. "At the restaurant, when you warned me about what Silas was planning, and again tonight." Nora did not offer a reply. She honestly did not know what she could say. She did not fully understand her own actions herself. "Why did your father die?" Ezra asked her suddenly, his question cutting through the quiet. "I do not mean because of the job. I mean, why was he doing that kind of work in the first place?" Nora looked down at her own hands, at the calluses that her father had left behind, a strange kind of inheritance. "It was because of my mother," she said, her voice completely flat. "She had cancer. We did not have any money. We did not have any insurance. My father did everything he possibly could to try and save her." A heavy silence settled in the small cabin, broken only by the gentle sound of water lapping against the hull and the distant hum of a cargo ship moving through the bay. "She died anyway," Nora continued, her voice quiet. "I was 12 years old. We had to sell our house to pay for all the hospital bills. After that, we lived in our car for 6 months. My father just kept taking jobs," she explained. "Each one was more dangerous than the one before it, because he did not know how to do anything else." "And then came Beirut," Ezra said, finishing her thought. "And then Beirut?" Nora nodded in confirmation. "I received his ashes in the mail, along with a short letter and just enough cash to survive for a few months. The letter he wrote had only one sentence on it. Thornton betrayed me. Never forget." Ezra lowered his head, his expression hidden from her. His hand was still resting on her bandaged arm, as if he had completely forgotten it was there. "So what did you do after that?" he asked quietly. "For all those 9 years?" "I disappeared," Nora replied, her voice turning cold. "I worked 27 different jobs in 14 different cities. I never stayed anywhere longer than 4 months. I had no friends, no lovers, nothing at all in my life except surviving and waiting." "Waiting for what?" he asked. "For an opportunity," she said, finally meeting his gaze again. "The chance to find the Thornton family and do what my father never could." Ezra did not flinch from her intense gaze. His face showed no sign of fear nor a flicker of anger. Instead, there was only a deep understanding and perhaps the faint shadow of his own pain. "So why didn't you end my life?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. "You certainly had the opportunity. You had more than one chance to do it." Nora paused, carefully weighing her response for a long, quiet moment. She could have easily constructed a fabrication, a noble tale of forgiveness, or a grand gesture of mercy, but she was profoundly weary of deceit. Because when I stared into your eyes, she finally confessed, her voice quiet but firm with truth. I did not see Harrison Thornton. I saw an entirely different person. I saw a man who had turned back into chaos to rescue a complete stranger in a restaurant. I saw a man desperately trying to mend the destruction his own father created. A man who refuses to abandon his people, even when they are calling for his death. She drew a shaky breath before continuing. My father always told me, never judge a person by the blood that runs in their veins. He said to judge them by the choices they make, and the choices you have made are nothing like your father's. Ezra watched her intently for a very long time, his gray eyes unwavering and unblinking. Then he slowly raised his hand, his thumb tracing a delicate, light path along her jawline. The touch was so incredibly gentle that Nora almost convinced herself she had imagined it entirely. You have shouldered this immense burden all by yourself for far too long, he said, his voice thick and raw with emotion. Nora felt completely frozen, unsure of what to do or what words to say, so she remained still in the cool, dim light of the cabin with her enemy's hand resting on her face. And for the very first time in 9 long years, she did not feel utterly and completely alone in the world. They did not flee, was the first thing Ezra stated as the early light of dawn began to paint the Seattle skyline a soft pink through the cabin's small window. Clove is convinced that I am dead. He will be celebrating his victory tonight at the Velvet Room, declaring himself the new ruler of this city. Ezra then rose to his feet. He moved to a corner of the small cabin and forcefully pulled a heavy tarp away from a large wooden chest. What lay underneath was an arsenal that Nora had never anticipated. There were handguns of various calibers, sleek submachine guns, tactical stun grenades, sets of body armor, and enough ammunition to properly equip a small military unit. These are backups, Ezra explained simply, noticing the shock on her face. For days that feel like the end of the world. Nora let her eyes linger on the collection of weapons before shifting her gaze back to him. You are planning to go by yourself? He offered no direct answer. Instead, he started meticulously checking each firearm with the practiced, fluid ease of someone who had performed the task 1,000 times over. You can remain here, he said, his focus still on the weapon in his hands. You have already done more than enough, far more. Ignoring the persistent, dull ache radiating from her bandaged arm, Nora pushed herself to her feet. She stepped up beside him, confidently picked up an MP5, and expertly checked its magazine. I have spent 9 years of my life running, she stated, her voice perfectly level. I am tired of it. Ezra finally stopped his work and looked at her. In the pale morning light that filtered into the cabin, his hardened expression seemed to soften. The coldness was gone, replaced by something that closely resembled profound admiration. You understand that this could very well be a one-way journey. I am aware, Nora replied, snapping the magazine securely into place with a definitive click. But if this is how I die, I want to go down fighting, not running away. Ezra gave a slow, deliberate nod. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was the first smile she had ever seen from him that was not laced with coldness or mockery. Your father would have been incredibly proud. Nora did not know how to respond to that, so she chose to say nothing at all. She continued her preparations, methodically sliding 2 spare magazines into her belt and tucking a stun grenade deep into her jacket pocket. The Velvet Room was the glittering jewel of the Russian district, an opulent nightclub occupying an old, sprawling building that had once been a textile factory. Saturated red neon light bled from every window. The heavy bass of the music thumped into the street outside, like the powerful heartbeat of some great sleeping beast. A slumbering monster. Nora and Ezra made their approach at 11 o'clock at night, just as the club was reaching its peak capacity. They avoided the main entrance completely, instead navigating through the dark back alley where two guards were casually smoking cigarettes near the fire exit. The men had no time to react. Ezra moved like a phantom in the shadows, impossibly fast and completely silent, neutralizing both of them before either could even raise a hand in defense. Nora followed him without hesitation, stepping over their still forms without breaking her stride. Inside, the wall of music was almost physically painful. Flashing strobe lights shattered the scene into disjointed, silent frames, like an old, chaotic film. Nora's eyes expertly scanned the crowd and quickly found their target. Victor Klov was seated on the second-floor VIP balcony, surveying the pulsating dance floor below him like a monarch observing his kingdom. He wore a pristine white suit, held a champagne flute in one hand, and had a thick cigar resting between his fingers. More than a dozen armed men formed a protective circle around him, all carrying weapons, all dangerously intoxicated on a victory they already believed was theirs. "I see 14 visible gunmen," Nora whispered directly into Ezra's ear, so close that their skin briefly touched. "There are likely more hidden from view." Ezra nodded once, his intense gaze fixed solely on Klov. "You take care of things down here. I am going up." With that, they separated, melting into the dense crowd. Nora moved purposefully toward the stairs while Ezra began to circle around the length of the bar. She steadied herself, counting her breaths to calm her racing heart. 1, 2, 3. She held her position and waited for the signal. Then the music abruptly died. A profound silence descended upon the club, as heavy and suffocating as a wool blanket. A wave of confusion rippled through the stunned crowd. And then, Ezra stepped out onto the center of the dance floor. He wore a simple black shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal his powerful forearms, appearing terrifyingly serene amidst the sea of frozen bodies. "Victor," Ezra's voice resonated through the entire club, without the need for a microphone, each word clear and lethal. "You are sitting in my chair." On the balcony above, Klov shot to his feet. His champagne glass slipped and shattered on the floor. The cigar fell from his trembling fingers. "Thought." "Thorn." Klov choked out the name, his face draining of all color, as if he were staring at a ghost risen from the grave. You are supposed to be dead." "I am something much worse than death," Ezra replied, his tone chillingly cold. "I am the landlord, and you are being evicted." Klov's fear quickly curdled into a desperate rage. He snapped his fingers and shrieked at his men. "Kill him! Kill both of them!" The balcony erupted into a frenzy of motion. Weapons were raised, all aimed down at the dance floor. And in that instant, Nora moved. She slid with incredible speed across the slick floor, flipping a heavy oak table on its side for cover, just as the first volley of gunfire tore through the air directly above her head. The thick wood splintered under the assault, but managed to hold. Ezra vaulted over the bar, now holding twin suppressed pistols in his hands. He rose from behind his cover and began to fire with a ruthless, calculated precision. 1, 2, 3. 3 of Klov's shooters dropped to the ground. Nora braced her MP5 on the edge of the overturned table and fired controlled bursts toward the main staircase, pinning down the men who were attempting to flood onto the main floor. 2 of them fell immediately, while the other 3 scrambled back for cover. "Surround them!" Klov shrieked from above, his voice cracking under the strain of pure panic. "Do not let them get away!" 3 more gunmen suddenly rushed in from a rear entrance, trying to execute a flanking maneuver. Nora spotted them instantly and acted without a moment of hesitation. She pulled the stun grenade from her pocket, yanked the pin, and lobbed it in a high arc toward them. She squeezed her eyes shut and pressed her hands over her ears. The resulting blast was a blinding flash of white light, searing the retinas of anyone looking. The three men screamed in agony, clutching at their faces as their guns clattered uselessly to the floor. Nora surged forward from her cover and neutralized each of them with precise, efficient shots. Ezra had reached the balcony, moving like water, both fluid and deadly, disarming and disabling Klov's men with brutal efficiency. He closed the distance to Klov, who was now trying to flee through a back exit, shamelessly shoving his own men forward to act as human shields. He was nothing but a coward wearing a king's mask. Nora bounded up the staircase, leaping over the bodies of fallen men, her eyes fixed on Ezra and Klov. She saw Klov spin around and draw a gold-plated Desert Eagle, raising the massive handgun to aim it directly at Ezra's chest. She did not have time to think. She simply reacted and fired. The bullet tore through Klov's right shoulder. The gilded weapon was thrown from his grasp. Klov collapsed to the ground, screaming in agony as blood sprayed from the wound. Ezra looked down at his fallen rival, then his eyes found Nora. She was standing on the bar below, her Glock still raised, a thin curl of smoke rising from its barrel 50 feet away through the surrounding chaos. A confirmed hit. She lowered the gun and gave him a sharp nod. Your turn. Ezra seized Klov, who was desperately crawling toward the exit and leaving a dark, smeared trail on the red velvet carpet, and violently hauled him over to the railing. Below them, terrified partygoers stared up in stunned silence. Please, Klov sobbed pathetically. I will pay you millions. I will leave Seattle forever. I swear it. Ezra kicked the golden gun away and met Klov's gaze, his own eyes as gray and cold as ice. You tried to have me killed, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. I could have forgiven that. That is just business. He tilted his head slightly, pulling Klov even closer. But you also tried to kill the woman who saved my life. And that, he paused, is personal. Who is she? Klov cried out, his voice frantic with desperation. Who is this woman that you would protect her like this? Ezra looked down at Nora. She was standing amidst the wreckage, her hair wild and untamed, her face speckled with the blood of her enemies, her weapon still held firmly in her hand. She no longer looked like a waitress. She looked like a goddess of war. She is the partner you never saw coming, Ezra declared. And with that, he threw Klov over the railing. The Russian boss crashed down onto the DJ booth below in a shower of sparks and shattered electronic equipment. His scream was cut short by the brutal impact of metal. An absolute, deafening silence followed the fall. Ezra stood alone on the balcony, gazing out over his city. The enemy had been defeated, and the traitor had been exposed. He was king once again. Before making his way down, Ezra's eyes met Raymond's across the ruined club. He received a silent, grim nod in return, a somber confirmation that Silas Monroe had been officially and permanently erased from the organization. His calculated betrayal had ended at the bottom of the sound. When Ezra descended the stairs, he did not immediately head for the exit. He walked with purpose, straight toward Nora. She stood there, a solitary figure amidst the complete devastation of the Velvet Room, the gun still clutched in her hand. The air was thick and heavy with the metallic smell of gunpowder and blood. She was exhausted, a weariness that settled deep in her bones. But for the very first time, In 9 long years, she did not feel like she was running from anything. Ezra stopped directly in front of her. His black shirt was stained with blood, and the cut on his forehead remained untreated. He looked at her with those gray eyes that were no longer just cold steel, but now held something much deeper, something she did not dare to put a name to. "Is it finally over?" she asked, her voice raspy and strained with fatigue. "This war is over," Ezra replied, his tone firm. He reached out and gently took her hand in his, the hand that was marked with the calluses of a practiced shooter, the hand that had saved his life 3 separate times in a single week. But there is still much work to be done. Clove was only one of our enemies. There will be others who challenge us. There are always others. Nora looked down at his hand enveloping hers. "So what is it that you want from me?" "Stay," Ezra said, his voice low, direct, and leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Do not stay as a servant, and not as a weapon. Stay as my equal." She raised a skeptical eyebrow. "You are extending an invitation to the woman who swore an oath to kill you to become your partner?" "I am extending an invitation to the woman who possessed every reason to let me die. And yet, she chose not to," Ezra corrected her. "I am inviting the only person in this entire city whom I truly trust." Nora remained silent for a very long time, processing his words. She thought about her father. She thought about the 9 agonizing years she had spent running, about the countless nights in shabby motel rooms, wondering if her life had any meaning beyond mere survival and waiting for a chance at revenge. She looked at the man standing before her, the son of her greatest enemy. He was the man she should have hated, the man she should have killed, yet she felt no hatred for him. She was not sure what she felt, but it was a universe away from hate. "This is not some kind of fairy tale," she said with caution. "I am not searching for a prince or a castle to live in." "I know that," Ezra said, stepping closer until only inches separated them. "And I will not promise you that life will be easy. I can guarantee there will be more enemies, more bloodshed, and more nights exactly like this one." "Then, what is it that you can promise me?" she asked. "I promise that I will never abandon you," Ezra vowed, meeting her gaze with an unwavering intensity. "Not like my father abandoned yours?" "Never." In that moment, Nora felt something long held tight inside her chest finally begin to loosen, that she had gripped so tightly for 9 long years. It was not complete forgiveness, and it was certainly not love at first sight. It was simply an acceptance that while the past could never be undone, the future was still unwritten. "All right," she finally said, her voice clear. "But the next time we go out, I get to choose the restaurant, and it will not be Italian." A real laugh escaped Ezra's lips, not the cold or cynical smile she had grown accustomed to seeing. Then he leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was a mixture of gunpowder and spilled blood. It was a taste of shared exhaustion and hard-won victory. It represented two people who had journeyed through their own personal hell and somehow managed to emerge, still standing. There were no fireworks. There was no romantic score. There were only two deeply wounded souls discovering solace in each other among the ruins. As they pulled apart, the wail of police sirens began to echo through the night. Ezra took her hand in his and led her through the back exit. Together, they walked through the darkened alley and vanished into the deep shadows of Seattle. Behind them, the opulent velvet room, a symbol of a corrupt empire, burned brightly against the night sky. In front of them lay a future that no one could have possibly predicted. But for the very first time in 9 agonizing years, Nora Sinclair was not running from her past alone. The waitress, who had lived her life being invisible, had become the one woman the most powerful man on the West Coast could finally truly see. In the end, she did more than just help a mafia boss find justice. She rescued herself from the lonely prison of hatred she had built around her own heart. This story proves that sometimes the person who is pouring your water is actually the most dangerous individual in the room. And sometimes the very person you believe to be your greatest enemy becomes the one who stands beside you when the rest of the world has turned its back. This story is a powerful lesson that our past does not define our destiny. The choices we make are what truly shape us. Nora could have embraced hatred and sought simple revenge, but instead, she chose the harder path of forgiveness and moving forward. Ezra could have chosen to live under the dark shadow of his father's unforgivable sins, but instead, he chose to become a different kind of man. Every single day, we all face similar choices. We stand between our past and our future, between holding on to hatred and finding forgiveness, between running away and finally facing the truth. The only real question is, what will you ultimately choose? If this story managed to touch your heart, we ask that you please like it and share it with the people you love. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on all your notifications so that you never miss one of our emotional stories, which we post every day. We would be honored to hear your own thoughts. If you were in Nora's position, do you believe you could have forgiven Ezra? If you have ever carried the heavy weight of the past on your shoulders, how did you finally learn to let it go? Please share your experiences in the comments section, because every single story matters, and we value each word that comes from the depths of your hearts. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to watch. We wish you and your family abundant strength, lasting peace, and true joy in every single day. Goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again in our next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons.